Jeffrey Tucker, it has been 2 years since we spoke. The last time we spoke was on the beaches of Acapulco, frolicking with fellow, maybe we weren't frolicking, but you know what I mean, yep. Anarchists abounding across the land. And it was a delightful experience. And the world is in a very different place to how it was in February 2019. On the one hand, Bitcoin is flying, but on the other hand, 2020 has dealt many great blows to the fight for liberty. Why don't we start with that?
Well, you know, people keep going shopping and getting COVID. I read that in an English newspaper this morning. They've got track and trace, you know, all over England. You know, it's a really highly competent system. You download an app on your phone that tracks where you are, and so they track people between November 9th and November 16th and discovered that fully 17% of the people who tested positive for COVID had been shopping. Now, if that doesn't tell you something, I don't know what to know. That's some science right there.
I tell you what does concern me is this unholy alliance that we've seen emerge between large tech and governments. And we saw it in the US election. At least from an outsider, it seemed that, you know, Facebook and Twitter with their war on fake news were very much on the side of the Democrats, but also with things like track and trace and this thing of if you've been near a person that's got COVID, then it's going to show up on your phone and then you can't go out. That's concerning, isn't it?
Oh, well, first of all, the whole thing is preposterous from the. So the idea of track, trace, and isolate, you know, that could pertain in a rare case like something like Ebola or maybe SARS-CoV-1 from 2002, 2003. But even that's a little bit complicated because, you know, there's this inverse relationship between the severity of a disease and its prevalence, right? So if something's really severe, it's going to kill its host, boom, like that, and then it's going to kill a lot of people, and then the virus is going to burn out. It's a bad virus, a stupid virus. But SARS-CoV-2 is kind of a smarty pants virus, so it is only really a fatal risk for somebody like 0.05% of the population under 70, and so it's very widespread. So it doesn't do any good to track and trace. You can't control this virus. So they're testing out all these crazy, wacky surveillance technologies on a virus that resists anything like track and trace. There was a hilarious study done in the U.S. military the other day where they got something like 3,000 soldiers and put them through extreme regimentations of six feet apart and mask wearing and, you know, hopping around doing the kabuki dance and like they were making this deal. And they had half of them. They said that they would test them constantly, and if they tested positive, then they would isolate them from their roommates who was 6 feet away from them and put them in isolation. And they hoped to demonstrate that testing and isolating could control the virus. Well, the study comes out, identical rates of infection between the two groups. Identical. So it clearly did no good whatsoever, which, you know, infectious disease experts warned us months ago, actually at the beginning of the pandemic, that track, trace, and isolate would not work for this virus because it's any more than it would for the common cold. It's a mild respiratory virus for the vast amounts of the population. So you're not going to be able to control the spread through any means at all. Forget track and trace and isolate. I mean, you cannot control the spread through lockdowns, through closures, through travel restrictions, through social distancing, through masks. And none of that works. So we've got here the ultimate demonstration of the powerlessness and stupidity of government. And the reason this has gone on for 9 months, Dominic, in my view, is that the governments are unwilling to admit this.
They can't. They're too proud to admit their own stupidity. The lawyers are probably telling them not to admit anything because of all the legal ramifications. There are the electoral ramifications. Yeah. There's the sheer hubris of government generally. I think in medieval times, we used to have divine right, where kings believed they were appointed by God. And I think this same delusion of divine right has spread to governments today, where they somehow think they're cleverer than everyone else. And they're just riddled with incompetence. They're such large organizations, and large organizations are generally inefficient anyway, because size and efficiency are related. And so this combination of arrogance and stupidity is extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
But for all these reasons, they won't admit. I mean, you saw with quantitative easing and monetary policy, they didn't stop. They just carried on doing it. They won't. Perhaps the greatest example of all is the First World War. They didn't stop. They could have stopped, but they just carried on.
Yeah.
And in carrying on, they made it worse and worse and worse. And there's so many things that concern me as a campaigner for freedom and liberty and individual responsibility. But it's this power, this combination of power, arrogance, hubris, stupidity, this unholy alliance between tech and government. Tech's like doing everything government tells it to in order to ingratiate itself and solidify its monopolies. I mean, we've seen this incredible growth of crony capitalism and I don't know what to call it, techno-fascism or something.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, tech's wonderful because it empowers you, but on the other hand, look what's going on. Look how it's being used.
I was, the biggest techno optimist there was, and I'm just devastated. I have a whole book celebrating. It's called Beautiful Anarchy, celebrating the glories of Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, and all these things. And so it's just humiliating for me to see what's happened. But on this question of the industry, I think it's very interesting that in 2011, the World Health Organization published a very interesting editorial written by 3 Danish doctors, and they said something really interesting. They said this was after the H1N1 scare of 2009. So I don't know if you were in Europe at the time, but H1N1 was kind of got this scary name because it's the same flu, more or less, a different strain, as the 1918 flu. So there was a worry, that it was going to mount to something. And so the panic never reached the US, but in Europe, pharmaceutical companies, together with the media and all of these infectious disease experts who had kind of been waiting for their moment in the sun, in the same sense that the climatologists were so overjoyed about climate change, and it's like media interviews and fame and grants coming in and that sort of thing. So we have all these infectious disease experts with various names, epidemiologists, immunologists, virologists, and they live for the next disease they wanted. And the media, which just loves a scary thing, no matter what it is. And then you have the pharmaceutical companies who are just really anxious for all kinds of grants, and all the money pours into all these organizations when there's a disease scare. So in 2009, billions of dollars were spent sending vaccines and ventilators and ICU beds and everything all over Europe. Everybody's panicked and freaked out. The media's screaming, H1N1's coming, we're all going to die. And then nothing happened. It was a mild flu season. And so these 3 Danish doctors said, look, we cannot live in a world with this vast industry waiting for disaster to happen. They even went one step further. They said something fascinating. They said it's very common to say that we need to be prepared for the next pandemic. We are way over prepared. We're so prepared for the next pandemic that we can't wait for it to happen. This entire apparatus, this machinery of disease panic has got to be dismantled before it creates a disaster. And that was the World Health Organization in 2011. Really interesting.
Yeah, there's no doubt that there was a whole team of people, a bit like you have a bunch of soldiers trained for a certain military situation, and they can't wait for that military situation to happen because it justifies their entire existence as what they're trained for. Something similar seems to have happened with virology experts. But it's just Go
That's
on.
right. I mean, a good example, I was like, and just the infectious disease industry. And by the way, there are lots of these people with integrity. I mean, 40,000 of them have signed the Great Barrington Declaration, so God bless them. But there are enough of them out there accessible to the media. There might even be a minority. I think it might be even a small minority, but they're all available to the media, and the media knows who they are, and so they keep quoting them. They're on Zoom calls all day and quoted on CNN. But it's a little bit like, if I had a certain fanaticism, like I believed only in laced-up shoes, and that was my whole life. And just like writing articles after articles, that loafers are a disaster for your posture. Loafers are terrible; they're ruining your feet. And then one study comes out that seems to confirm this, and suddenly the media is calling me up, and And I could create a worldwide panic over the existence of loafers and everybody, dumping their shoes and freaking out. It's just some similar kind of fanaticism these people feel. And one of the main proponents of this, what you would call misophobia, or germophobia, is of course Bill Gates, who for a decade and a half has been giving all these Zoom talks and things and money away and giving billions of dollars away, just warning about the next disease. Now, why he thought that he was ever so sure that this disease was going to be terrible and it was going to wipe out half humanity, or that you could control it through these mitigation factors and lock down society and this sort of thing, or for sure that you could get a vaccine to get rid of it. I don't know. I mean, as far as I know, he doesn't know anything about viruses or immunology or epidemiology. He's never studied the subject. But he somehow got a bug in his head, that this was the next thing that was coming. For all I know, this is all taken from his experience in the computer industry. We have a computer that's perfectly well functioning, and then somebody sends you a virus, and it disables the hard drive, right? So the answer is to have antivirus technology on your computers. I think he must have thought of vaccines as a kind of antivirus technology, and that the way to deal with the next virus is just to get away from it and block it. But you can't.
Does he make money? Does he make money out of vaccines and so on?
Surely he does. Surely does. I tend to think this is just pure intellectual confusion because I doubt that he would do this purely for. I mean,
well, he doesn't need the money, but he's a genius at making money. I mean, it wasn't his genius not so much that he was a brilliant computer scientist, but that his father was a brilliant patent lawyer, and so he was able to protect and acquire other patents, and that was the secret of his fortune. It was more protectionism than computer genius. I read that once. I'm not sure if it's entirely true or not.
I don't know that for sure, but it sure does sound plausible when you put it that way. I mean, patents are a disaster. And I never really connected the fortunes of Bill Gates with the existence of the patent industry. But, that very well may be true. But I think ultimately the guy is just really stupid when it comes to medicine. I don't understand it because, you could, like when this pandemic came along, the very first thing I did is I went to Amazon and I downloaded Cell Biology for Dummies. And I read it. And I got all schooled in the history of pandemics and in immunology and in the behavior of viruses and the trade-off between prevalence and severity and so on. So I got smart on this. I don't think that Bill Gates has ever done such a thing. I don't think he's read a single book on the topic.
Where are you in the States?
I'm in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts.
And tell me about, is it South Dakota that's been the sort of most leave it to individuals to decide what to do in its response to the virus?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, she's a governor, Kristi Noem. Very interesting.
And is she something of a heroine, or is she done well? Or?
Yeah, no, she's fantastic. In fact, there are people that are talking about her for the top of the Republican ticket in 4 years. I mean, she's that good. But the extraordinary thing about her is that when the thing came about, everybody in the whole country was like, oh my God, no, we better shut. And she kind of locked down for she said, oh, schools no more and the restaurants and bars. But it lasted like a week. And then she thought, I don't know, this all presumes that government's really smart, but let's just presume that the citizens of South Dakota are smart. Let's just do that way. So she opened up everything and has not budged at all. Now,
is she hated for doing that?
By the media, but not by the people. She's enormously popular. I mean, she's hugely popular all over the country.
And is that that's a Republican county? Is it a Republican state?
Yeah, it's a Republican state. So she's hugely popular. She's a hero to her people. Because they,
and the business is moving to South Dakota.
Yes, and travel, and people are moving in, and things are business is going great. Do you know that South Dakota right now has a 3% unemployment rate? 3%. The rest of the country is like 14, 15, 16.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so she's better than Sweden.
And what about taxes in South Dakota? Are they high? Are they low?
No, they're really low. I know you were wondering about where you're going to move to next.
Yeah.
Believe me, I've looked at houses in Sioux Falls. I mean, it's a wonderful place. I mean, it's not a big city, you know.
What's the biggest city in South Dakota? Sioux Falls.
I think Sioux Falls. There's another one with another funny name but I've never actually been there. But the thing that you don't get in Sioux Falls is the ballet, the symphony, large-scale sports events.
I don't buy into these subsidized art forms, Jeffrey.
Okay, but here's the thing: you don't get that in New York either.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Where is Massachusetts on full lockdown? Is it or how?
We've been in lockdown since April, yeah, and mandatory masks and that sort of thing
Since April.
Yeah, since April. Really?
And you didn't open up over the summer?
No, since late March. No, we never opened up. Yeah, we haven't had any cases here since April. I mean, arguably, we saw herd immunity achieved already. So what happens with the pandemic? It goes like this. It goes up, and after the first deaths, kind of tears through a population really quickly and gets the vulnerable, the people with low life expectancy and that sort of thing, and then it gradually dies down and goes through a lull, as they call it, the Gompertz curve, and then the pandemic becomes endemic, which is to say, predictable and easily managed, as anything else. So arguably, this happened already here in April. But once you get it in your head that you're going to a zero COVID world, right? Then every bit of news you get is bad news. Test.
Yeah.
And so suddenly...
And this socialist thing is we don't end lockdown until there are no more cases.
Yeah, that's what they really believe, in which case you're going to destroy the world.
Well, it's quite interesting because, like, when, as soon as, like, we have the BBC in the UK, which is basically state media. My friend calls it the TV tax when he has to pay his license fee. But it just means that the BBC becomes politicized. We have state healthcare in the UK. And so as a result, healthcare has become politicized. We have state education in the UK, and so education has become politicized. As soon as the government becomes the main provider of something, that thing becomes politicized. And then you look at something like the clothing industry, which broadly speaking, government doesn't get involved in, and it's completely apolitical. There's no political division in the clothing industry beyond, I dress this way because I'm a goth, or I wear a T-shirt with MAGA on it, or whatever it is. But in the actual production of clothes, it's pretty much apolitical. And to a certain extent, the same applies to food. And as soon as government gets involved in something, that thing becomes politicized. And what's ridiculous now is that COVID-19 has become a political issue. It's another thing that divides left and right, authoritarian and libertarian. And, it's a disease. It's got nothing to do with politics. Does that frustrate you?
What's insane, and as you say, inevitable, right? I mean, once you put government in charge of mitigating disease, it's going to be filtered through the lens of politics. But actually, you're right. The data are astonishing to look at it. In the U.S. right now, you might wonder, whether and to what extent people are supporting these lockdowns here. Initially, it was something like 80%, right? Which is disgusting. But people should never have supported this nonsense.
They trust their government, Jeff. And the media scared them.
Yeah, that's right. But now the support is down to less than 50%. And incredibly, you have a third of people polled in the United States saying they will not comply with a new lockdown. Just like no chance. A third, fully 1/3 of Americans have said they will not comply. What's fascinating about this data, and in my article on this, I didn't even report this because it's actually kind of disgusting, is that I think something like 85% of that 1/3 identify as Republicans. And what that means is that the Democrats are fully locked down. Now, let's pretend for a moment as if these disease mitigation measures are actual science. What would that have to do with politics? I mean, why is there such a partisan divide on a basic aspect of medical science? It should never be like that. Makes no sense. Science is true or it's not, you know? This is the way to mitigate disease or not. Your case fatality reduction is associated with lockdowns or not. It shouldn't matter what your ideology is. So yeah, we've ideologized basic facts of cell biology. What the hell? It's a disaster. But inevitable. That's exactly what, you know, and I said that this was going to happen. January 27th, I wrote an article saying if we do anything remotely like quarantining, that's what we used to call it earlier this year, it'll be filtered through a political lens, and we won't be able to make rational decision making over what to do with the disease because we'll all be fighting over politics. And the sides have flipped, right? I mean, so like in second 2 weeks of February, all the center-left journalists were going, settle down, calm down. This is not a bad disease. It's all going to be okay. Protect the vulnerable. Everybody else, go about your business. This is Psychology Today, Slate Magazine, The New Republic, Vox, all the center-left publications in America were saying this. And the right wing at the time was all apocalyptic. Oh, you know, the disease is coming, run for your life. This is the big one. You know, good thing you've been a prepper all your life. You know, store up toilet paper and rice and beans and water because this is a bad thing is coming. And then recall that, so the New York Times was the first one to flip. And it was like very, very late February, early March. They started becoming apocalyptic. And then they kind of gaslighted Trump into blocking travel from the UK and Europe and Australia. And then the initial round of lockdowns was actually pushed by the Trump administration. But then, like, about a month later, he was like, I don't know. It seems like I'm destroying this great economy and this is going to be political trouble for me. So he started to open up, you know, a little bit. And then the sides flipped. So suddenly now all the Republicans became like open up people. And that's sort of where it stabilized. And it got more intense. And so as we're leading up into the election, now you have all the Republicans against masks, against lockdowns, against business closures and schools closures and travel restrictions. And the left has become full Stalinist, you know. So it's just been the wildest time.
You've written your new book. It's called Liberty and Lockdown. It's a great title. Mm-hmm. Almost wrote itself, but it's a great title nonetheless. Tell us how we can buy that. Give it a quick plug.
Oh yeah, it's just Amazon.
Because probably you cover a lot of the issues we've just talked about.
Oh yeah. It's all on Amazon. You can get it. But a lot of what I go through in the book is like Dominic, I'm really pleased with this book because I did a lot of very serious, deep research into all these past pandemics and how we didn't lock down and how the press covered them and how we mitigated them through herd immunity strategies and things like this. But I also cover some of the deeper history of lockdown ideology, especially dating back to the to 2005 and 2006, when the very idea of locking down first was floated by Neil Ferguson and in the UK, and then Robert and Sarah Glass in the US. And none of these guys have ever studied infectious diseases. I mean, Neil Ferguson is a crystal physicist, and Robert Glass is just a computer programmer. And they convinced the U.S. White House under George W. Bush to write lockdowns into the Center for Disease Control's planning for the next pandemic. And there it went in 2006. They were recommending not extreme lockdowns, but like school closures and business closures and abolition of mass meetings and so. But hardly anybody paid any attention to this. And 14 years went by when we didn't even know the governments had this kind of power, much less the will to destroy our lives. And then boom, just like overnight, it was all implemented. These guys lived inside this little bubble. They were just talking to themselves for 14 years.
It's amazing. I don't think that lockdown caused by COVID-19 could have happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. I just don't think it would have been possible because the international communication, the spread of news, the spread of panic, it just couldn't have happened in the pre-internet world to the same extent. And by the time the news had filtered through and one government started acting, the virus would have almost burnt itself out if this idea that we're past the pandemic phase is right. It just, we couldn't, in 1951 or something, 1971 even, I don't believe the lockdown could have happened.
Well, and also,
it's a sort of modern phenomenon. It's a consequence of modern fake news, modern communication, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, the 24, all the news organizations competing for your attention 24/7. There's that.
There's that, and also the way that government's set up. It just couldn't have happened. Track and trace. It just could not have happened.
Couldn't have happened. The other thing is we didn't have this overclass ruling class that can live off their computers.
Yeah, exactly.
And in their house shoes at home. So here's the thing, Dominic. In the past, before the age of liberalism, before the age of enlightenment, we're talking about Middle Ages, ancient world, and even to some extent during the slaveocracy of the Deep South and the 18th and 19th century. The way it's always worked with disease is that the ruling class likes to imagine that itself to be clean of disease, right, and to avoid all disease. And it works so long as the ruling class is a small minority of the population. What they do is they foist the burden of herd immunity on the poor, the working classes, on the slaves. So in the Deep South, slaves are always sick all the time, getting the newest pathogen. They had strong immune systems, but the masters are always letting the pathogens be absorbed. And they would move actually, to wherever the disease was not. The ruling class would move there and then push the slaves to where the disease was, to use them as sandbags essentially. And that was true in the ancient world with the slaves and the merchants, and the non-free citizens were always forced to bear the burden of sickness. Or you can have a look at a civilization like India, where you have actually in a whole class of people assigned the job of getting the new pathogen and staying permanently unclean, and they're called the unclean. So in pre-modern societies, you assign the burden of herd immunity to people who are different from you by virtue of race, religion, social class, language, the immigrants, whatever the trashy people's society. And the overclass keeps itself clean, and they imagine themselves that this reflects their virtue and their holiness, that they can't get a disease. But with modernity, we decided, in a sort of social contractual way that's endogenous and evolutionary, to share the burden of living amidst pathogens together, equally and democratically, while using intelligence, not bias, not discrimination, to protect the people who are vulnerable. So we figure out who's vulnerable to the new disease. In this case, it would be the aged and the sick, and we protect them, and then we agree in a sort of social contractual, endogenously social contractual way that we're all going to share it together. So we all take risks, and we go out about our normal life, and we get disease, we get immunity, we move on. That's just the way it's always worked. In the course of the 20th century, through most of the 19th century, especially the 20th century was good about this, especially after 1918, where there were a lot of quarantines that didn't work and it's really bad. So throughout the 20th century, we've been very rational about disease, but also very sort of equally sharing the burdens. In 2020, suddenly this Zoom-based overclass, with the laptops, came up with a great idea. How about this? We'll let the grocery deliverers and the healthcare workers and the workers and peasants and the people who have to go to job, let's let them get the disease. We'll just stay here and stay home and stay safe. And even better than that, we'll pretend as if we're doing society a favor. Stay home, stay safe. Wear a mask, and get your groceries delivered, and have Uber Eats come to you and deliver all your food to you, and let them get sick while you stay safe. They can just leave it on the front porch, and then we'll just ride this one out until the vaccine comes. It's disgusting. It's pre-modern. It's selfish. It's not benevolent. It's against freedom and against all principles of democracy and equality. But we've created an overclass, and that's exactly what lockdowns are. It's we'll be protected. I'll have more time to tweet. I'll still get my salary. Let those other people bear the burden of herd immunity. Let them get sick. That's what's really going on here, Dominic.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. I haven't looked at it like that, but there's definitely this two-class thing. Mm-hmm. Those that can work at home and those that can't. Mm-hmm. And it's also those who work for big corporations, those who don't, those on public sector salaries, those not. It's really hurt freelancers.
Yeah, and
Really
the
hurt them.
bars, the bowling alleys, forget them, the theater,
Yeah.
all those people who go to the sports things, people throw footballs around, to hell with them. It's a pandemic. You're not essential. You're not essential. You're non-essential workers. So you have to lose your
So,
job. We're essential. It just so happens we're so there's the essential non-essential division is by itself very cruel. But there's two kinds of essential workers. It turns out. People whose job can't be taken away because it's basically on computer. It doesn't matter. And you can work from home, and then there's the people who deliver the food and provide the healthcare and that kind of stuff to make our lives more comfortable and more wonderful. So those people are also deemed essential. So it's positively feudal, the way we've divided society up, and it's consistent with the way things were in the ancient world in the Middle Ages. In fact, this thing has been so consistent with the Middle Ages that we even decided to abolish dentistry.
amazing. So tell us about the Great Barrington Declaration. Where do you stand on that? What is it? Where do you stand on it? Can it save us?
Oh, yeah. So maybe I wasn't clear about this, but I live in Great Barrington, right? So, and yeah, and
Is that your town?
Yeah, and the Great Barrington Declaration was drafted here where I work.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
How exciting!
Yeah. So what happened was, God, I don't know, it was like September or something like that. And I figured the lockdowns were going to be over in
It's
April.
like living in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire.
Yeah, the town is not our biggest fans, by the way, but because this is the world center of overclass protected Zoom workers. But it was sometime, I guess it was September, I noticed that there was a Harvard professor tweeting against lockdowns, and he was an epidemiologist. And I thought that must be the loneliest person on the planet Earth. So I just dropped him a note on Twitter, and I said, why don't you come visit us? And he said, well, who's us? And I said, well, we're over here at the American Institute for Economic Research, and we have, I'll bring in our private chef, and we'll take care of you for the weekend. He goes, now that sounds interesting. So he showed up, and I invited a few other anti-lockdowners from New York and New Jersey and the neighboring community. We all hung out here for the weekend, didn't do anything other than just drink cider and drink martinis, and drank some wine and drank a little bit of beer. And hung out for the weekend. And all we did is talk about COVID the whole time. Blah, 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 blah. COVID this, COVID that. And we all learned from each other. It was really good. It was a really good session. It was nice for me because I got to test all my ideas on, like a world expert, Martin Kulldorff. And so then about 10 to 14 days later, he said to me, listen, we have to do something. These journalists are hopelessly ignorant, and we need to school them on public health. And I can't think of a better place to do that than the American Institute for Economic Research. So let's hold a meeting with top-end journalists, and I'll get 3 really excellent public health experts in, and we'll just hold a little Q&A session, and we'll just hang out for the weekend. So I said, well, let me look at dates. I said, well, who are these people? He said, well, it's Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford, Sunetra Gupta from Oxford, and me. And so we'll just we'll do this. And I said, but let me check dates. And I said, well, I've got the October 31st open. He goes, yeah, that's really not going to work. It's too late. We need to act on this now. And this is something like October 2nd, I said, when do you want to do it? He said, this weekend. So it's like, wow, that's really soon. Well, they all came here, and we did indeed hold this little session with the New York Times journalists and some other British medical journalists and that sort of thing. And it was about a 2-hour interview session with Bhattacharya and Gupta and Kulldorff. And then after that, we had some separate interviews on the questions of herd immunity, and then they went into private sessions where the journalists were able to interview the epidemiologists, the scientists. And then all the while, they were working on this declaration, and Kulldorff came to me and said, well, we're writing an open letter. I said, well, open letters are kind of boring. Do you have any other ideas? He said, yeah, why don't we call it a declaration? I said, well, that's good. What should we name it? And he said, well, I think we should call it the Great Barrington Declaration because that's where we are. I said, okay, the town will probably get upset, and the town did get upset, actually. And so it was, the draft was finished on Sunday, I would say like at noon. My webmaster created the website that afternoon. They went on the next morning they were no, that late that night they went on the Unheard with that podcast.
I know.
Yeah, and so so our webmaster was still working on the site. The next morning, when I got a text from Kuldorf, and by this time they had left, saying this, we have to go live with the website because Unheard podcast just mentioned it, so we have to go live. And our webmaster
With Freddie somebody.
Freddie Sayers, I think his name.
Yeah.
And so our webmaster, he said, well, it's not really ready. I said, well, we got to release it. So he built that website over the course of like 4 hours, that afternoon, and then released it, the next morning in a panic. And I remember Jay Bhattacharya saying to me, this is going to be a big deal, and we could get 1 million signatures. And I remember thinking in my mind, you are so naive. There's trillions of bits of information just dumped on the world every second. There's no chance that there's very little chance this thing is going to get any attention at all. It certainly won't get 1 million signatures. And this is taking a very mainstream position. And the media is completely locked down, will never break through. Well, I was completely wrong. Because that Great Barrington Declaration has now been on a 4 or 5 week news cycle. It's just nonstop news.
And it won't go away, will it?
It won't go away, and it's so because it's very simple, it's very powerful. It just makes very very basic statements about cell biology and public health. That's it. It just says, here's what you do in a pandemic with a mild respiratory disease. You protect the vulnerable, focus protection, and everybody else go about their business. That's what it said. And it's been a wild explosion, of like for against, but it really did kind of embolden, I would say, a global movement. And now it's been translated into 50 languages. So I don't know, Dominic, we were all very frustrated these days. Like, how the hell does this thing happen to us? What can we do to make a difference? Well, this has made a difference.
It really does.
And Bhattacharya,
we're citing it here.
Yeah, and Bhattacharya believes, and I'm not, I'm not sure he would know, but he told me 2 days ago. He says, "We're 50% the way there. We've half won this struggle."
Yeah. Well, fingers crossed. Now, tell me, have we seen across the States the return of the speakeasy? Is this rumor that I hear true?
Oh, sure. No, they're all over New York. Private parties every single night. It goes on constantly. But look,
New York's supposed to be in lockdown, is it?
Yeah. Well, when you're living in a world in which governors have decided no more than 10 people can gather in the same house or the same facility at once, what are you going to do? Come on. That's crazy. So what the lockdowns are teaching everybody is if you want to have a regular life and not kill yourself, you have to figure out a way around the law. That's, what else are you going to do? And we face crazy travel restrictions in this country too. So that if you go to Texas or something like that, there's a mandatory 2-week quarantine before you can leave again. And if I come back to Massachusetts, there's another mandatory 2-week quarantine before you can leave again, and so on. Now,
how do they know you've been to Texas?
Well, they can't find that out. Nobody has,
unless they track you on your phone or something.
Yeah, but you'd be an idiot to turn that little thing on your phone. Honestly.
But Google will know.
Yeah, well, that's true. But here's the thing: there's not really anybody in this country who has very much of a strong incentive to enforce these rules. And so everybody's just kind of perfunctory going through the motions. I ate in a New York restaurant the other day, and I dutifully gave my name, to be tracked and traced. And the guy behind me walks up, says, "What's your name?" He said, "Mickey Mouse." The guy wrote down Mickey Mouse. "What's your phone number?" 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He dutifully wrote that down. The guy got seated just like I did. So business has to go on. Life has to go on. Come on. This is crazy.
Yeah. What's the Liberty's been dealt quite a few blows in 2020. What's the future? What's the solution? How do we save the world?
Well, I think we need ironclad promises from anybody who holds public office ever again that something like this can never and will never happen again. So,
but how do you get that?
Yeah, well, I think first of all we have to get get smart about viruses again and get over this fear that they have, and I think that's the real struggle. It's an educational problem.
But there's been such a land grab, Jeff, in the course of this thing. There's been such a land grab by the authoritarian left, occupying, stuff that was previously, the evidence of pretty much every crisis. I know this because I've just written my tax book, and the evidence of, and I use tax as a measure of freedom. And the evidence of every crisis is that government uses that crisis to increase its powers, to increase levels of taxation. And then when the crisis has passed, things never go back to the levels they were before the crisis begins. There's a bit of seeding, but it's never back to where it was beforehand.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's usually true, but we've never been through a crisis that has been so obviously and universally calamitous as this. So
yeah, but it's obvious to you, but it's not obvious to a lot of people.
It's getting increasingly obvious. That even in some of the richest neighborhoods in this country now we have long food banks. When the stories are coming out every day about missed cancer screenings. About deaths from dementia and long.
Do you really have food banks in rich areas? Really?
Yeah. No, they're long.
Well, because rich people can't afford to buy their own lunch.
Don't even understand why. Because even the richest areas has the workers and peasants out there, many of whom have lost their jobs. So now they're lined up for blocks. I mean, in Dallas, Texas, the other day, it was never had a hunger.
I saw that actually. I saw that. That was the traffic jam, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's true. Even in the Berkshires. I mean, honestly, I was driving through town the other day, and there was a long line of people standing. I thought, I wonder they're shopping or something, or maybe some chicken restaurants giving away free chicken nuggets or something. I didn't know. No, I looked at. They're handing out boxes of food, and a line around the block for people. People are hungry. I mean. It's created like vast poverty. Do you know?
It's incredible. In America, I've never been anywhere where food's so cheap.
I know. It just I thought we'd solved the food problem and then we unsolved it. It's something unbelievable. And right now, one of the sectors that's booming in this lockdown economy is home sales. Well, guess what that's about? People
having to downsize.
Yeah, people are dumping their houses and moving into small apartments while they're cheap, or they're moving out of lockdown states into unlockdown states, or young professionals are moving back home with their parents and selling their newly acquired houses while they can. I mean, that's why housing is booming right now. Do you know that right now that there's more young people between the ages of 18 and 29 living with their parents than ever before in recorded American history? Because people just moved back home with their parents, and what are they doing? They're not working. So for a while they got unemployment checks, and now they're just watching Netflix and contemplating suicide. It's effing outrageous.
One of my Bitcoin billionaire mates, who I sort of laugh at, but he's been right about everything. And he now lives with his boyfriend in New Zealand, where he's bought a bolt hole. But he says where we're going in the future is kind of, luxury holiday type resorts like Club Med. I don't even know what you call them in America, but they're sort of Club Med or Butlins here in England, where all luxuries are provided, all food is provided, everyone is on universal basic income, and they've got VR headsets on their head all day. Do you think that's a realistic possibility?
That sounds dreadful, but the thing...
It's horrendous.
The thing I keep going back to, though, is just the fact that human beings ultimately, they're not happy living in cages, and we are living in cages right now, and I just don't think that people are going to tolerate it. There are growing protests. I mean, you see the protests all over Europe and the UK, and the U.S. much less so, but even they're starting here. There's a huge protest planned in New York City on Sunday. And I don't know how to defeat it. I think it's got to be, we've got to get past the age of Trump. That's really important, so that people can think clearly about this. Biden will own this virus in a matter of months, and then and he's talking about locking down, but I don't actually think he will. I don't think he'll lock down because he wants to actually preside over a growing economy, and probably he's got a few halfway intelligent people around him who understand you can't suppress the virus and live in a COVID-free world. I don't believe that. Then the vaccine's going to come along. Most people won't get it because they don't want it, but at least it'll have the existence of it will have a nice placebo effect, and people can settle down and calm down. And then we can start evaluating what happened in this ghastly year of 2020. And we need to lock down our states is what we have to do. Open up our societies and lock down our governments. That's got to be the agenda.
Well, the problem that we have in Europe that you don't have in America is I don't think a proper revolution is now no longer really possible in Europe in the way that it once was, because, our state, our government is armed and our people aren't. Mm-hmm. So there's just straight away, this isn't necessarily an argument for guns, because that's one of the libertarian arguments that as an Englishman I'm not very good on, but people aren't armed and the government is. And so it has extraordinary power because of that. Now that you don't have that same dynamic in America. People are armed, so there isn't that same power gulf between ordinary people and the government. So if you wanted to have a revolution, it's that bit more possible.
I'm not sure if it's because of the arming issue. Ultimately, governments are controlled by public opinion, I believe. And when public opinion shifts and shifts and shifts, and politicians start getting the message that they're going to get voted out of office, or they're going to face media.
Jeffrey, I hear you, but you get Republican one term, Democrat another term. It's just a few percent of GDP, the difference. And ultimately, it's ever expanding government. It's the only thing that differs is the rate at which it expands.
Right.
And, America's more libertarian than Europe is. America, you're still at 40% of GDP, something like that is government. Whereas here in Europe, we're closer to 50%, in some parts of Europe, over 50%. We're further down the road than you. But on the one hand, I think we're quite doomed in a way, but on the other hand, technology is so empowering. So even though, in 1895 or something, we were freer than we are now, on the other hand, we're able to do things, albeit under government restriction, but we're able to do things that we couldn't do 125 years ago now, things with our phones and computers and cars and planes and all the rest of it. So on the other hand, that's better. But I don't know, where is Libertaria? Where is the freest country on earth? Where does one flee to?
That's actually one of the mysteries of 2020, because, I have a lot of friends of mine who've moved to weird places like Cancun and this sort of thing. All those places locked down. All the tax havens.
I know.
The places that didn't lock down in the world are places like Taiwan. No lockdowns at all. They did no testing and no lockdowns, had almost no cases, almost no deaths. So, and we can talk about why that is.
Japan?
Japan never really locked down. That's a slightly complicated situation. There was some belligerence in South Korea, but not nearly like what you saw in the U.S. South Dakota, it turns out to be one of the freest places in the whole world. And ironically, Tanzania. I bet you never thought about moving to Tanzania before this crisis.
Nice beaches.
Yeah, but the funny thing about the Tanzania situation is that it was presented in the press like the dictator there was a COVID denier and blah blah blah. No, that was heavily informed by serious epidemiological and public health concerns. They decided not to destroy the population. But who could have predicted that in 2019 that Tanzania was the place to be during the pandemic? So it's a problem. The other places that are there's some places that had a lot of stringencies, but they're so widely ignored that they were mostly irrelevant, like Mexico. So, my friends in Mexico said it's no evidence of lockdowns anywhere. Everything's just completely normal.
Yeah, Argentina had a really stringent lockdown and nobody paid it any attention, did they?
Oh, is that right? So Guatemala has a very strict, and Peru has very strict lockdowns, but everybody has to comply with it. They're enforced by the police. So you just don't know.
I think in a lot of those South American countries, the law is a guide.
Yeah, yeah, right, right. But you're right from a libertarian point of view. You know, in the old days, people used to say that to get liberty, you had to make a choice between voice and accent. So on one hand, voice means you object and say, no, I won't comply with your ridiculous orders, and that's very effective. But even more effective is exit. You just leave, and that there'll be a population drifts out of the tyrannical places and into the freer places. Well, what happens with both voice and exit are completely shut down. And that seems to have been one of the effects in 2020. We don't even know where to go. We don't know how to get there. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Like South Dakota seems like a good example, but what happens if she gets settled? You know?
Where even is South Dakota? It's right in the middle somewhere.
Yeah,
Where is it?
Upper Midwest. You know, I mean, it's like one state away from North Dakota, and then one state away from the Canadian border. So
okay,
it's about the same winters as here. I don't mind that. Yeah, look, I've been looking at homes. I just want to live in freedom. You know,
I want to go to South Dakota and pay tribute.
Yeah.
I watched her do little talks, and I started following her on Twitter, and I watched her talks, and you're like, this woman's great.
Yeah, she's amazing.
She's passionate and she's strong and she really cares.
Oh yeah. You see the video?
She's good looking.
Yeah, well, there's that. But did you see that funny video? She said, in South Dakota, here's how we socially distance. And she held up a gun and shot a bird out of the sky.
We're all going to go to South Dakota. Show me the way to South Dakota.
But actually, I must say, I'm not that much of a partisan. You aren't either. I'm not really very political. But I must say, the Republicans have been pretty, according to the polls anyway, Republicans are like 80, 90% against all these lockdowns right now. So that's good. That's very good.
Mm-hmm. I read that without the Libertarian Party, the Republicans would have won a lot of the marginal states that they lost to the Democrats.
Yeah, I saw that. There was something, I think, in Michigan or something that said that. So that's a pretty interesting. Walter Block was really upset about this. He wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. He said, what's wrong with you libertarians and what he calls the purple states, you know, the swing states? He said, you voted for the libertarians and caused Trump to lose. You know, well, okay. You know, I don't know. You know, I mean, I'm on one hand, I like the way Trump ended up the election. It was like all in favor of openness and these big rallies and no masks and everything. I really appreciate that. But, you know, the fact is that he's been terrible on international trade. I mean, he's divided the U.S. from the rest of the world. He's caused China to put together the biggest trade agreement in the history of the world, and it involves a third of the world's economy. And he was responsible for all the initial round of lockdowns. I mean, we just can't forget that. It was a disaster. I mean,
yeah, but he got, look, you know what his mistake was? Not fighting an overseas war. If an American president in his first term has an overseas war going on, then he always wins the next term. That was Trump's mistake. Peace.
And now he's withdrawing all the troops from Afghanistan and.
Do you know what he should do in his last 3 weeks or whatever it is, assuming that he doesn't overturn it, which I don't think he will? He should pardon Snowden. And he should pardon Assange.
Yeah.
And he should free Ross Ulbricht.
Thank you for adding Ross's name in there. all three of those things should be done. Just let
he should do three of those. Given that in most states drugs are being made legal now anyway, he should free Ross Ulbricht and anyone in a federal prison for marijuana offences.
Oh, right.
He should do that. Do you know what I mean? He should do something like that, and that would really make his legacy. So let's get the word, and hopefully Trump will hear that.
Well, if you can stop it with all this election, and I kind of agree with you. I don't think there's any chance that that Trump wins the second term based on these lawsuits and the evidence I've seen so far. On the other hand, the voting odds are actually going up for him. Did you notice that?
Oh, are they?
Yeah.
So that means the bookies think he actually stands a chance, or a bigger chance than he did a week ago.
As of this afternoon, I think it was at 13%.
Oh wow! Oh well, that's good. They've already paid out on Biden over here.
Yeah. I guess that's right.
Jeff, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, and thanks very much for coming on. And why don't we close by you plugging your book one more time?
Yeah, it's called Liberty Lockdown, Amazon.com. I think it's a good read. I'm really proud of the book. It's got 250 footnotes, because so it's all kind of got the apparatus and everything, but it's also, I think, a fun read. And I started writing this in March, really. So it's a kind of a chronicle of everything that's happened. And I'm really happy with it.
Amazed you'd be able to get it out so quickly.
Yeah, well, I rushed it out, but it's still, I think it's good. Thanks to my staff here at the American Institute for Economic Research, they really worked fast on it. So, and it's selling really well, and the reviews are really good. So, and also Amazon didn't censor it. So that's
good stuff.
Yeah.
And if we want to follow you, can we follow you on Facebook or Twitter or something?
I'm so sick of Facebook. I can hardly stand it. So yeah, go to Twitter, Jeffrey A. Tucker. That's JEFFREYA Tucker, and I'm up to 51,000 followers. So I'm really happy about that.
Wow.
So, and send me anything that you want me to tweet out, because I'm really trying to serve my followers with good information. We're in an information war at this point, and Dominic, I can tell you, maybe you're usually a happy person, as I am too. And this year has been hard, I think, on both of us, but let's not give up hope. We have to keep fighting. If Bhattacharya is right that we're 50% done, we've still got a long way to go. But there's things that we can do to make the world a better place. I have to believe that.
Great stuff. On that note, Jeffrey Tucker, thank you very much.